Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, October 9th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And this week we have an really interesting one for you. I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Lena Andrews. She is a military analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. She earned her PhD in political science from MIT, where she specialized in international relations and security studies. And she has spent more than a decade in foreign policy, having previously worked at the Rand Corporation and the United States Institute of Peace. She has a new book out called Valiant Women, the Extraordinary American Servicewomen Who Helped Win World War II. Lots of exciting things that you probably didn't know. I definitely learned a lot in this one. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Lena Andrews. Well, Lena, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about your new book, Valiant Women, the Extraordinary American Servicewomen Who Helped Win World War II. And whenever I talk to somebody who's done intensive reporting and sort of written about history, written about something that's already passed, I think it's important that we at least start by talking about you, the person, you, the writer, and what your interest in this area was. And I mean, you in and of yourself are super interesting. You're a military analyst at the CIA, also a political scientist. Like, how do you get, I've actually, this might sound weird. Sorry, I'm going to talk your ear off right here at the top. This might sound weird, but with my other podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, we actually visited the CIA a couple of times and we went on their internal podcast as guests. I don't know if I'm even allowed to say the name of the podcast on air. So it was really weird. We've been to the CIA twice. We met a bunch of people there. We learned that you're called analysts. And there were all these cool scientists. We talked a lot about evidence-based policy and just about science and why science matters to the CIA. And it was really, really fun. And I don't know, this was years ago now, but I feel like I've enjoyed my time at the CIA, which is a weird thing to say because most people have never been there.
You know, it's a surprisingly friendly and open place when you're in it.
Yeah, there's a museum and stuff.
Yeah. There's a great museum. You do have to get invited. Yeah, the gift shop is great. I've gotten many Christmas gifts from there, but I am a military analyst. Where we are forthcoming, we love to be because we so rarely can talk about our work. But in this context, obviously, I think the main thing is that it demonstrates for me that, I've had this sort of lifelong interest in understanding military operations, both in the contemporary context and in the past. And what I found is that some of my best work in, the modern world has come from my understanding of the past. And so, the agency is fortunately one of the few places that really respects and loves history in that way. And so I've been delighted to work there with such incredible people. And, if anybody can get in, I suggest they do get in. It's a lot of fun to go. It's, as you said, it's kind of surprisingly chill place for all of our spookiness.
And academic, I was impressed by how many just cool nerds there were there.
Yeah. And that's what drew me to it initially because, I come from an academic background. I'm a trained political scientist. I have a doctorate in political science and international relations in particular. But, I wanted, and while I wasn't keen on sort of sticking in the academic environment because of lots of personal reasons, I did want to be in an environment where there was a real respect for inquiry and, like you said, sort of scientific process and thinking through the way that we ask and answer questions. And I found that, at least in the government and in the policy world, the agency is one of the best places for that. So, I was thrilled to be surrounded by nerds just like me, as I'm sure you understand, having or being in this world, in the sort of doctoral world as well. There's a certain type of personality that's sort of always wondering how should I ask that question or how should I answer that question? And I love being surrounded by those types of people. So it's been a really wonderful fit. And they, of course, were very generous to let me work on this book for so long. And it's been a great marriage in some ways.
So I have to ask because I feel like a lot of people that I met that worked at the CIA either sort of came from an academic background or from a kind of military background or both. But your approach has been purely academic, or have you also worked in the military prior to working at the CIA?
Yeah, no, so I'm increasingly a rare person, which is to say, I'm a civilian. I have no military experience. I've never served in uniform. I have, a lot of experience talking and studying the military just based on what I did my doctoral work on and sort of environments that I've been in. But I am fully a civilian, which, like I said, is sort of increasingly and unfortunately a little bit rare these days. You don't find a lot of people who are civilians and are kind of interested in the military despite not serving in it. And so a big part of my mission with this book is to, has always been, in my work in general, I should say, is to make sure that when I'm writing about military operations or when I'm writing about military things in general, I'm writing about it in a way that is both correct and accurate, and the military community will, find resonant with their experience, but also is written for a generalist audience, is written for people who don't have that background, who are civilians, who might be intimidated by the ranks and the brass and the, funny little acronyms that the military uses. So that's been a really important thing for me, is to sort of act as a translator between the two communities. And I've always really loved that. And so hopefully if folks pick up the book, they'll feel like they understand what's going on.
Which is it's so important, not just as you put it, for the sort of translational aspect, right? Being able to bridge that divide and make sure that the people who are reading this aren't, confused. But I think it's also probably really important just from an accountability perspective, just having somebody who is doing this research who doesn't have certain types of, I don't know, biases or ties is going to actually be, I would hope, a little bit more objective as they're digging deep into this history.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up the point, because it's actually what drew me to this world in the first place, which is to say, I started in a policy job in DC, and I was actually in a place called the U.S. Institute of Peace when I just graduated from college. And I was at this place that was studying peace and conflict resolution and conflict management. And 90% of the time that we were having these conversations, there were folks in uniform in the room. And I was sitting there thinking, clearly, like, these guys are involved in conflict resolution and peace management and war and peace and the whole spectrum of things. And I can't understand what's on their uniforms. I don't know if they're important. I don't know what they do. And for me, that felt really kind of unusual and uncomfortable, to be in a room having a conversation with someone and having no idea what their sort of background and experience meant. And so that was the motive for me, was to sort of get a little bit more clarity about what this world was. And once I started peeling back the layers on the onion, I found it to be one of the most interesting sort of bureaucracies in the world, which is not how many people think of the military, but it really is just a very, very big bureaucracy that's responsible for, fighting our wars, which is an unusual mission, but in most other respects, it's just a big hierarchy. And so, for me, then when I went to graduate school, so much of what I was doing was focused on civil military relations and sort of understanding how we got to a place today where most civilians, unless they know somebody in the military or have a family member in the military, are increasingly sort of insulating themselves from this community that is doing a lot of the hard work of keeping us safe and, fighting our wars and doing all those things. So it was a very natural evolution, but one, like, as you know, that started with a sort of feeling of not as much accountability, but also just sort of like, how could I not know about this incredibly important feature of our democracy?
Right, right. And so, last kind of silly thing that I want to ask before we dive into some of the content of your work. So you mentioned that you're a military analyst at the CIA. Are you an officer? Isn't that the title that most people had there, was officer, not
Yeah,
agent? I
well,
remember being taught that.
well, we tend to call ourselves intelligence officers, which is, I
Right.
think, a reflection of the larger sense of sort of national security mission. But it doesn't mean in the same context. There's no like officer and enlisted, for instance, as there is in the military. There are ranks, of course, but I'm not like a lieutenant or something like that. But yes, there is. I think the agency shares, rightly, because we work so closely with warfighters and particularly in the military analysis community, there is a sort of shared feeling of mission, and a lot of people from one community come into the other community. You know, there's a porous boundary there, which I have loved as someone who, again, is a civilian studying this stuff, to be able to interact so closely with, you know, folks doing things on the operational and military side. So we are called officers, although not, you know, in the sort of cool military way. We'll
And
take what we
definitely
can
not
get.
yeah, and definitely not agents, right? Everybody
Yeah,
thinks you're
no, we're
called
not.
agents, but you're
And
not
everybody
agents.
thinks we're spies. We're not, right? Like we're not
Right.
spying on them. We're just, you know, at least I am just an analyst. I just sit at a computer.
Yet you spy on history. And so, yeah, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about this really interesting work that you've done and the reporting that went into it. So, obviously, there's some bigger conversations, but before we even dive into any of the themes, I would love to just get kind of the quick and dirty elevator pitch of sort of who are these valiant women that you wrote about, these service women in World War II. Sort of what brought you to this topic, and how did you sort of identify what and whom you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I love the elevator pitch because I think hopefully it resonates with a lot of people, which is to say, I spent decades studying World War II. I thought I knew everything about it. You know, I've read every book on the shelf. I thought I understood it. And of course I knew about Rosie the Riveter, and, you know, I'd read all the books about women who broke codes or were agents behind enemy lines, that sort of thing. But what I didn't realize until really quite recently in my sort of broader career is that the reality is that the scale and scope of women's contributions in World War II is so much larger than just Rosie or just the spies and code breakers. You know, over 350,000 American women served in military uniforms in World War II. And it wasn't just the size, which is, you know, to give folks a sense about the size of the today's active duty Navy. It wasn't just how many women served, it was also what they were doing. They were in these critical support and supply roles that most people don't think of or appreciate as being important to combat operations, but are really the backbone of the battlefield. And so for me, it was this perfect meeting of, one, being a really interesting story about women, and two, being a really interesting story about war, and especially this war that I've been studying for so long and sort of thought I understood, but had to reconsider as I looked at it through the eyes of women.
So let's talk a little bit about what it means to serve in World War II. Like, these women were serving in uniform. I'm looking at this like stunning colorized photograph that's on the cover of the book. I mean, these women are wearing uniforms. They're, you know, standing in front of, I don't know, is that a Jeep? I think so.
It's a military
Yeah.
Jeep.
And so talk to me about, like, what does it mean to serve in uniform? Were these women, these were service women, were women allowed to be enlisted prior to World War II? Were there enlisted women already?
Yeah, so there were women who had served in uniform. In fact, I'll start at the very beginning. Women have always served on the battlefield. Most of the time, up to and including the revolution, right? But most of the time they've served as nurses, which most people don't recognize as a really important military function, and is a big part of the book for that reason, because I really try and outline how important the medical community is, especially in World War II, but has always been. So
I guess I didn't realize that they were actually enlisted, though. I
mhm.
thought that they would be like contracted or something like that.
Well, sometimes they are. And World War II employed everybody was involved in World War II in some way. But the nurses were, you know, often officers actually, and some of them were enlisted as well. But, you know, the nurse corps has been a feature, not necessarily, in a formal way, but certainly in an informal way on battlefields since, like I said, the American Revolution. In World War I, the Navy for the first time opened up their doors to a small group of women who they called the yeomanettes, which were yeomen, which is a military term essentially for an enlisted person. And it was just a kind of cutesy little name for them. And there were about 10,000 of them. So there were women who served in World War II, in World War I. There were also a group called the Hello Girls. They served abroad and they were answering phones and cables and doing that sort of thing. So there were pockets of women who served in uniform before World War II. But it wasn't until World War II that the military services fully opened their doors to women across the board. So, I mean, all of the military services, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, the Army Air Force, which was part of the Army at the time, had a contract force, as you just meant, as you talked about, but they were effectively, officers in the Air Force at that point. And like I said, they were doing literally every job you could imagine. I think they were in every combat theater. They were at one point in like 2/3 of the military occupations available. They were, laying cables on battlefields to make sure that the headquarters and the front lines could communicate. They were drawing maps for forces in Normandy. They were fixing planes to go back to the Pacific. They were doing kind of everything you could possibly imagine, up to and not including firing weapons on the front line. So that's where the bright red line went. But they were really, really involved in pretty much everything else.
I was going to ask about that because I feel like we sometimes make distinctions in the civilian world that might not be we might not be using the right language, or there might not be a clean distinction. But one of the things that you often hear is like women in combat, which maybe is not as appropriate as the question of like women, I don't know, armed women. I don't know what's like. You're like the bright red line. You made it quite clear. So were they at this point not even trained in how to use arms?
No. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and this is what I'll say was a really big misconception among civilians, and in part again is because of this widening gap between the civilian world and the military one, which is right combat. Frontline combat is like the guys who are literally shooting at the end, can see the whites of their eyes kind of thing, right? So that tends to include things like artillery, infantry, those sort of heavy guns and things like that. Women were not generally serving in those roles. But what we forget, so take an artillery battalion, for instance, guys who are shooting really heavy guns at the enemy from, a long distance. Of course, those guys are fighting the war, right? There's no question about what those guys are doing. Artillery in World War II is incredibly important. What people don't realize, I think, is that up to that unit, that battalion of artillery, there are an incredible number of people and forces involved in sort of making that happen. And in World War II, women were involved in every single stage of that. So things like training anti-aircraft artillery groups, using live weapons in Delaware is an incredibly important thing so that these guys know when they go to the Pacific how to use it. And women were doing that, right? So while women weren't necessarily on the front lines, they were certainly engaging with and participating in a lot of the sort of training activities, a lot of the maintenance activities. They were the ones who were helping to fix the tanks. They were the ones who were, accounting for all those tanks and making sure they were in the right places. They were the ones who were outfitting the guys with their munitions and making sure that the right munitions were in the right place. So it's not like there's a distinction between the front line and everyone else. But there is also, it can at times be a very blurry line between, who's dealing with sort of weapons and the sort of what we would call hard brass tacks, combat operations, and who's dealing with the sort of softer side of things. And often what we found in World War II is that line got really, really blurry, really, really fast. And it has been that way since.
Yeah, I was wondering, so you mentioned the sort of bright red line, and the blurriness of it all. And I'm curious, do we have a bright red line now?
Well, women can serve in every service and every occupation now. Women can serve in combat, and have proven themselves to be very capable in that respect. And increasingly so as they're given more and more opportunities. So I think in that sense, although it's taken a really long time, women have stepped up to the plate and shown that not only are they willing to do this, but they can do it. But again, that's a product, I think, of women in uniform pushing that line continually, war after war after war, starting, even in World War I and before. In some ways, there was a big jump in World War II because we saw so many women in uniform, but throughout the 20th century, women were really pushing the limits of that. So, I know a lot of women pilots who were some of the first women to get into combat aircraft, and they had really difficult experiences, but also really impressive experiences because they were incredible pilots, right? Women in Iraq or Afghanistan, for instance, I think a lot of people remember they were part of the human response teams who were literally going into villages that couldn't be accessed by anyone else, but because they were women, they were able to get access to these places. So, I think we always sort of think of women in combat as being centered out of the conversation about what women can't do instead of what women can do in combat. And what we're increasingly seeing is the other side of the coin, what women can do when they're given the opportunity to serve in combat. And so I've been really delighted to watch that sort of evolve over time, but I'm also kind of devastated being a historian, realizing that these first conversations we're having 80 years ago are not being resolved until my lifetime, which is sort of sad in that way.
Well, and that kind of brings me to, I think, such an important question, because it's really easy to sort of shrug your shoulders and say, why is it this way? Why has it always been this way? And why is it that the assumption or that the policy was that women couldn't be armed, or women couldn't be on the front lines, or women couldn't be in quote unquote combat? And, it's easy to be like, well, because that's how it's always been, but like ultimately, when these women who were actively serving and who were pushing for more and more responsibility were asking their superiors, why not? What was the party line? Like, why? What has the rhetoric been from the American military historically that said, no, you can't?
So this is one of my favorite questions because, I talk about women in combat a lot. And my favorite answer to give to anyone who asks is that you don't need to ask me what I think of women in combat. You need to ask Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall and, Hap Arnold, MacArthur, all of the sort of great generals of World War II started out the war very, very skeptical of women serving in uniform. And Eisenhower is my favorite example of this. He was like, we don't need these women. He's commanding in North Africa, which is our first major combat operation as the United States, as part of the Allies. And he's sort of like, how can I use these women? What am I going to do with them? Maybe they can answer phones. By the end of the war, he is literally the loudest and greatest proponent of integrating women, not just for wartime service, but on a permanent peacetime basis. And he actually comes out of his military retirement to testify on behalf of women serving in World War II, or serving on a permanent basis after World War II and after his experiences. And I think it sort of is a testament to how easy it is to sort of go, like you said, to what is familiar, what you know, what you expect. And I should mention this is also the case with people of color more broadly. But, the military commander at the time had seen wars being fought a certain way. And it wasn't until the manpower situation in World War II necessitated a major change that they sort of were jolted into thinking, okay, something has to change. And it wasn't until they actually saw women in uniform performing so exceptionally that they were really willing to make that flip. And the challenge, of course, is if you don't give people the opportunity to fail or succeed, then you'll never know. And I think increasingly we haven't given people the opportunity to fail or succeed in one direction or the other. But when, Eisenhower saw them succeeding, he was willing to change his mind, which I think is really the best testament to sort of how these things should play out. You got to give people a chance. And if Eisenhower and MacArthur and Marshall were willing to do it, then we should all be probably willing to do it as well.
And so is the reason ultimately, I mean, I know it's such a simple thing to say, but the reason ultimately of why these chances weren't given previously, like, it's just patriarchy, it's just misogyny, right? Like, just like there's this kind of preconceived notion that like women are incapable of certain things.
Yeah, I mean, people forget like the 1940s were a very different time in lots of ways. Some of it's eerily familiar today, but a lot of it feels like a foreign planet when you read about it. Women were homemakers, they were childbearers, they were barely led into the manufacturing industry at the beginning. It wasn't, but this is a really important undertone of the book, and I hope people take this away if they read it, is that total war demands exactly what it says, which is total war. It means nobody gets to sit out, right? And that's what World War II was. It was an enormous exercise in war fighting for the entire country. We haven't done that since. Hopefully, we'll never have to do it again, because it's a really terrible thing to have to do. But, that necessity is the mother of invention. And that's why, for the first time, women are, I think, even considered as being, possible gap fillers. And then, of course, they take their toe in the door and kick open the whole thing and show that they can do so much more than that. But at the time, it had never been necessary. We just didn't have the manpower considerations of World War II and any other conflict before. It wasn't as global. It wasn't as technical. It wasn't as, focused on machines and, things that required lots of people to man. And so it wasn't until the demands of war really necessitated a full, total contribution that women were even considered. And so in that way, yes, it was preconceived notions of what women could and couldn't do. And it was also just like the requirements of war changed significantly in World War II. And we could no longer let anyone sit out, certainly not women.
And that sort of, I think, brings us into an important point, which is that when you need all hands on deck because there is this global threat, the doors become open to a lot of people that, from a policy, a supremacy, a exclusionary sort of bias, you would have left out. And so now that you are being more inclusive, which on paper sounds amazing, what ends up happening is that all of these people who were previously excluded become a part of a club that might not want them there, and they're subject to all sorts of horrible harassment and discrimination, right? So not only are we talking about this massive influx of women, but also, like you mentioned, people of color, LGBTQI individuals during an era when, when they were not, it was not always friendly.
Oh, absolutely. And, I work really hard in the book to incorporate those stories, not just in like a chapter or two here or there, but really at the center of the larger narrative, because so many women of color served in uniform, thousands of women of color served in uniform. Many women who are part of the queer community served in uniform. And they, as you know, like had to engage in what in an organization and a hierarchy that they respected and that they cared deeply about proving themselves in, but also that mistreated them very, very visibly and very openly. And so that tension is something that I really wanted to be honest about and be clear about, because I don't, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that part of our history. But I think a lot of people like to think of World War II as a sort of swoony music and violin and misty-eyed and all that, when in fact it was a complicated war that was in some ways an accelerant for communities of color and for historically marginalized groups, and also put on display at the exact same time the contradictions of the American experience at the time. So one of my favorite stories that's weaved throughout the book is that of the 688 Central Postal Directory Battalion, which was led by the incredible Charity Adams, who's a Black officer, and at the end of the war is one of the highest ranking officers, Black or white, in the Women's Army Corps. And she's just, this group is the largest group of Army women to be deployed abroad during the war. They're sorting mail, which if anyone thinks is unimportant, they are mistaken. It's the equivalent of a lifeline for men in Europe in 1944, because the only way they can be reminded of home. And they do, of course, incredible work. They arrive at like a vermin-infested warehouse and sort through 6 months of backlog in 3 months. They can do something like 65,000 pieces of mail a day, which blows every other record out of the water. But Charity Adams, who's their commander, is overseeing all this work while simultaneously just being treated horribly, not just by the local population, but also by commanders in the Women's Army Corps and also, in the broader army. And one of the stories I just will quickly tell, because I love it, is about this sort of, I think, puts on display this tension really well between respect for the military and also the challenges of confronting the racism that she was faced with. She was showing a general who had come to visit. She was doing a review of her troops, and he was, for silly reasons, displeased with the review, even though it was essentially perfect. And he said he was going to send a white lieutenant down to show her how to do her job, which, she outranks a lieutenant significantly. And she turns to him in front of her, 800 troops or whatever. And she says, "Over my dead body, sir." And I love that because, she's basically saying, like, screw you, but also I understand that I'm in a hierarchy and I respect that institution, but I will not let you mistreat me in front of my entirely Black unit. And so to me, it's just this perfect encapsulation of the difficulties and that tension that a lot of these women were facing. And Charity Adams does it with such integrity. It's like so incredibly inspiring.
Well, and I think something that's so important that you've done here is that you have um, existed, you have researched and written about that nuance and about that tension. Because, as you mentioned, World War II in a lot of people's minds is a very romantic war, especially when they're thinking about the European theater. It's this very kind of like, it's the last time that everybody was really aligned and we were fighting for like the same cause. And but really, it was much more morally and ethically nebulous and complicated than that. But I think we also have a tendency to go like, well, that was then, but now everything's better, And the truth of the matter is that, like, no, this is still happening now. Like, women are still sexually assaulted in the military. Women are still definitely denigrated. People of color are still struggling. They're still, you can't overtly be a white supremacist in the military, but we've seen time and time again that male and white supremacy still dominates in American discourse. And there's still people serving who are like actively aligned with certain groups and who have this type of this rhetoric, this ideology, and it's really disconcerting, but it's not better.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, and at the same time, right, the Secretary of Defense is a Black man. So you're sort of, I think what is so important as a historian today, especially, is to acknowledge that it's complicated, and it's always been complicated. And that is the sort of beauty of the American story, is that it's not, if it were simple, we would be in an authoritarian state. That's when you get simplicity. There's a great quote from one of the founding fathers, which is basically like, authoritarianism is like a fast ship. It does really well in easy waters. It speeds along. A democracy is a raft. Like, it's messy. You're bouncing around. People are getting like thrown overboard, coming back on, but it rarely sinks. Right. So I think for me, what is really important is just demonstrating that these complications, these contradictions, we can't ignore them. We have to be honest about them. And we have to learn from them. I think you mentioned the sexual assault and mistreatment. It's a big part of the book as well. I think it's really important to talk about how women were treated in the 40s, in large part because we have come a long way on the way that we talk about sexual assault and violence in the military. We have a long, long, long way to go, but we are making steps in the right direction. I think part of that is acknowledging our history and acknowledging that while we still have a long way to go, we can improve, we can change. Active discrimination of the sort that we saw in World War II is probably still exists in the military today to some degree, but it is not common. When I talked to women who I interviewed, they were sort of like, sexual harassment was just the day, we didn't even have language to describe what was happening to us. If I said no to an officer for a date, I wasn't getting promoted. And that was just accepted, right? Like, that was just the way it was.
It was so overt. Yeah.
It was so overt. And I think that is something that it's really important for us to say because, again, World War II can sort of like, how amazing, how patriotic, how perfect was everything. But when you talk to these women, they acknowledge that it was complicated and that there were difficulties in their experience, but it wasn't the only part of their experience. And for me as a historian, sort of reflecting that back and letting people grapple with it today to see where we've changed is in some ways like the great joy of writing this, is to force people to think hard about those questions and come to their own resolution on them.
And I think it's also important when we think about history to think of history as this this constraint as this pressure. We talk about, like, in biology and in evolutionary biology, we talk about pressures, and history had this pressure, right? This social pressure, this cultural pressure. But we were the same species. This was not that long ago. Nothing changed about our capacities, about our intellect, about our, functionality. What has changed is norms and expectations. And I think it is important to remember that even though women were fully capable then, as they are now, and there's still a million things that we're not, seen as equals, it's still not egalitarian. This was a time when women weren't allowed to wear pants.
Right. Right.
it's like we have to remember what the social pressures on these women were and how progressive in some ways this service actually really was.
Yeah. And exactly as you note, it wasn't like it came down from on high. The heavens said women should be able to wear pants. Like that was just
Right.
something
Yeah.
we as a country decided, and the military leadership seeing women struggling to, I don't know, fix a truck, in Pearl Harbor, decided, okay, let's give her pants. That makes more sense here.
Yeah.
Like this is something that is not, it's not rocket science, but it's something that we as a military and as a country at the time felt was necessary. And we pushed ourselves to make that progress. And so, to me, that's exactly right. It's like a great, again, not underestimating or trying to dismiss or diminish the many, many instances in which women, face just extraordinary mistreatment, of which there are many outlined in the book. So don't worry, folks. We're not like whitewashing history here. It's impossible to do. But also to say, we have to be really careful about sort of thinking that it could, we're like the sky is falling when in fact we have made some progress. And I think for me, talking to the women and talking to women veterans was an incredibly elucidating and clarifying experience. And so I always encourage people, if you know a woman veteran or if you have the opportunity to meet a woman veteran, to ask her her and to really listen. Because I think what was really heartbreaking for me is recognizing, as I was talking to these women, that part of the reason we don't recognize the progress that we've made is because we haven't asked what it was like. We just sort of, I think a lot of the onus is on us in the sort of contemporary world to call our great aunt or to call our grandma or to call our aunt or our mom or whoever we know and say, you once mentioned this funny thing that happened to you. Could you tell me a little bit more about it? Because I think we live so much in the present moment and so sort of chronically online or whatever, that we forget that the human experience is surrounding us and that we really need to ask these people how things have changed. Otherwise, we're going to just have to read about it from, blogs or my book or whatever. So I really do encourage people to get out there and talk to the people that they know in these communities. You will learn something.
And I mean, I think that brings up what I think is a really, really important conversation to have. And I know that this is a little bit, let's say, meta or like contextual. Obviously, there's so many rich stories in the book. We're not going to have a chance to dive into them. Also, I don't want to just tell the book on the podcast. I want people to read the damn book. So like, I think that, I'm going to be talking around things a little bit, but I think an important conversation for us to grapple with here as we're sort of nearing the second half or the end of the episode is this conversation about, and this is an American ethic that I struggle with very, very deeply. So this is an accountability lens here, but this idea that when things aren't the way they should be, when there's injustice, when things are not going well, talking about it, bringing it into the light and saying, how can we improve? How can we fix this? Is fundamentally democratic and patriotic. Yet, I think that we have an ethic in America, and we especially, I do think, and maybe it's a stereotype, but we definitely apply this to our sort of military, to our government, to our police forces, that when something is wrong or bad, instead of bringing it into the light and saying, how can we make it better? We tend to double down, cover up, ignore, pretend it didn't happen. And I think it's super, super important that we have this conversation about what is unjust so that we can be better. so that we can improve based on our study of history.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think to your earliest question about sort of what drew me to this field in the first place, a lot of it is that accountability, which is to say, you can't, there's this thing called who's guarding the guardians kind of thing. And in my anecdotal experience with people in the military, and just in conversation with people in the military, they're not looking to police themselves, right? Like everybody kind of understands the contradictions. They respect the civil military line. They want enforcement from, the highest levels, and they want civilians to be engaged in what they're doing. Because they know it. That's like an ethos. That's a real key part of the American military enterprise, is that civilians are watching and they are holding the military to account. That is just fundamental. It's been a big part of how we've operated our military forces since the revolution. And so, I think that the ethos is in some ways like a little bit reversed. It's almost like we've ceded that territory of said, like, okay, whatever, the military can do whatever they want, or until something goes really, really wrong. And then we're back interested again. But for me, it's about like smaller things, like how is the military using their money? How is, how are they treating women and minorities, but also how are they treating just like enlisted guys? Are they getting the benefits that they deserve? How about veterans? How about mental health? Like all of these things.
How about civilians in other countries?
Yeah, exactly.
How
right.
Are we, how are we treating? Yeah.
I mean, you're exactly right. So there's so many things sort of for us to be concerned with about how the military behaves. And what I really appreciate about World War II is it puts on display, and I think when you look at it through the lens of women, it puts on display how important that oversight is, and how civilians really, particularly, Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration, people, even like women like Eleanor Roosevelt, were super involved in a lot of the senior military decisions around and related to the Women's Army Corps, because they knew that the stakes were really high and they knew that they were being watched and they couldn't get this wrong. And so, I think I would love it if people got a little bit more focused on, what our military is doing, how they're doing it. And I think, again, anecdotally, I think a lot of people in the military would appreciate a higher level of interest, because, had it not been for some of these civilian women who in World War II, for instance, who took an interest in the military, who decided to get involved, I don't think I don't think we would have seen as successful a force. And I think there's no harm in folks taking a closer look at it. And that's why I do what I do. And I hope others, can think about it a little bit as well.
Well, and I have to say, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I have to say that I appreciate kind of your candor throughout this interview, because I can tell you from experience, I've been a science communicator for a long time. I have a ton of literally very dear friends who work for institutions that are either private, public, or fully sort of government funded, like NASA. I mean, a lot of my friends are at JPL, which is like a complicated mixed venture. But when I would let's say I'm going to do an interview with somebody who works at JPL. If I am going to talk to them about a book that they put out outside of their position, they'll usually do a huge disclaimer at the beginning, like, my opinions now are of my own and they're not of my employer and blah, 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 blah. So now we can talk about my book. Or if I'm on JPL campus and I'm interviewing somebody, there's like a PR person sitting there going like, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about that. No. We've got to strike that. And like the fact that you and I, like you work at the CIA and you and I are just like having this candid conversation, and I haven't really heard anything caveated. So I'm super curious how easy it is for you to do this kind of press. And like, even when you wrote this book, did you have all sorts of eyes on it being like, no, can't write that. No, can't publish that. Obviously, I don't know if I'm going to trust what you say as an answer to that question, but I'm curious what the process is like for somebody who has a job like that.
Well, as a disclaimer, these are all my own personal views.
Yeah, you're like, whoops, at the beginning. I love it.
Well, so there are two things that are happening here. One is a very convenient fact of history, which is that, the sort of binding agreements about secrecy and things like that begin related to information starting in 1947 because of the ways that laws around national security information are written. So it was a post-World War II thing. So anything before 1947, which conveniently includes World War II, is much easier for me to write about as a military analyst because it doesn't inherently fall under that sort of bucket of classified information that someone will come after me looking for me. So that's very helpful. But that's just sort of a quirk of history. What is actually more helpful is that, of course, the agency and the national security community has been very involved in this process, in the sense that we're always there are processes for clearing information and things like that, and they're generally very robust and very clear and helpful. And so I have no complaints about that. And at the same time, what I think is really cool about this war, and it kind of gets a reputation for being dusty and old and arcane and something that people don't really need to know about anymore. But like everything that we've been talking about is about World War II, right? It's not necessarily, yes, there are contemporary corollaries to all this, but most of the content and the examples are World War II examples. They just resonate because it's a war that resonates. And so for me, it has been tricky at times. I'm not going to comment on current policy related to certain topics.
Right,
but
of course.
I can't, but because World War II is so relevant today in some ways, I can talk about a lot of things in that context that I think people are like, oh yeah, actually that still makes sense today. Women in combat being the perfect example. So, I would love to take credit for being like a very savvy government employee who's able to skirt the line. But it just turns out that this war is really effectively very contemporary and very modern in some ways that I think oftentimes people forget. And it's up to people like me to just sort of remind the public that we can still learn a lot from this war.
I'm actually curious, and this is just a kind of random question that you may or may not even know the answer to, but probably you would know the answer. When we visited the CIA, I remember looking at the I'm going to totally screw up all the names of this, but the sort of wall of the fallen officers, and the book that had the names and sort of what the individuals were serving on, and there were some that were blank because they were still classified, and we had this conversation about declassification. And I know that oftentimes we think in our minds, as civilians, we often think that there's some sort of specific time period, after so many years, everything becomes declassified. But that's not true, right? There are probably things about World War II that are still classified.
Well, I mean, no comment for sure on that one.
Right. Okay.
That's one where we get a little tricky. I can't talk about what is classified or not classified at this particular moment. What I can say, though, is you mentioned something which is deeply important to every CIA officer who comes into the building, which is the memorial wall. And that, is the officers who served, who paid the ultimate price. And I always like to point out that on one side of the memorial wall is the stars commemorating each of those people, some of which we still can't reveal their identities. And on the other side is a quote, which is "The truth shall set ye free." Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And to me, that ethos is so related to walking through that corridor is such an important reminder to me every day about why the work that we do is so important, but also why doing work related to our history and related to sort of uncovering the truth and the full truth, the whole story of what we've done is so important, because, the cost of it is right on the other side of the hall. If you don't get it right, if you don't know the sort of real truth of things in the national security business and in the business of war, the costs are quite high. And so I think this writing this book has been the great joy of my life, because I've been able to sort of understand the war in a really new way and understand the truth of the war in a really new way, in hopes that it improves our understanding of, how it was won, who was involved, and ultimately, in the context of the cost that we paid for this war, both financial and, in lives, I think that's a really important thing. So, that's my tap dancing answer to say I can't talk about classified information, but I can say that corridor is the perfect encapsulation of why I think a lot of people in our business do what we do, because the truth helps us clarify and understand so that we can at least minimize the costs on the other side.
And so whether we know or not about all of the service women in World War II whose lives were lost, because who knows what is still classified, one thing that maybe we could close out on is a conversation about that very cost, because you do write in your book about the fact that there were service women in World War II who did lose their lives in the line of duty. And so I would love to maybe have a reflective kind of conversation here at the very close about those women who paid the ultimate price during that war, because I don't know if that is a well-known fact.
Absolutely. And there are many stories. One of the things that we talked about at the beginning was the American Nurse Corps, or the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps. And many of the casualties that we saw in World War II were in this group of women because they were so close to the front lines. They were like literally miles transporting men back to hospitals in the field where they could do basic medical care and then moving them further and further back. But often nurses were among those who had sort of the worst PTSD, did lose their lives, did have combat injuries, but it was wider than that. The women of the Air Force service pilots, for instance, died in training crashes, 38 of them or something like that. So there are anecdotes and stories everywhere about women who paid the ultimate price. But the reason I brought up nurses is because one of my favorite and saddest stories is about a woman named Frances Langer, who was part of the Army Nurse Corps in 1943. And she was part of the Allied invasion in France and went ashore on D-Day. And she, while she was serving abroad, wrote a letter to Stars and Stripes magazine talking about what a privilege it was to help men who were fighting the battle get back to health and to give them a moment of normalcy, and to let them see an American woman often in the last moments of their lives. She writes this letter. It's published in Stars and Stripes. And then literally hours later, she's killed in the field. And, I think it's a really poignant example of, so many things about this book that I think are really important. One is that this was a woman who died in combat, not just in any combat, but in France. And the moment before she died, she was reflecting on how she could support the frontline forces, and what a privilege it was for her to have that experience and to be able to bring that joy to guys who were doing this important job. And then she pays the ultimate price, And so I think Frances Langer nobody knows about her today. Very few people know about her today, at least. But she's one of my great heroes because she is such an encapsulation of what I think real, true service looks like. And I hope folks take a minute to Google her or to look her up because she's an incredible woman.
And there are just so many, I think, examples. We have a segment on the other podcast that I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. We have a segment called "This Forgotten Superheroes of Science," which, it's a science show. So we're mostly highlighting women, people of color, people within the queer community who, you've literally never heard of because they didn't get the Nobel Prize, because they didn't get that award. And it's such an important conversation that sadly all too often these individuals are forgotten because they were, marginalized at the time, or just for whatever reason, because society didn't value their contributions as much. And so it is important because now is the time that we can go back and that we can reflect and that we can sort of situate these individuals in a more respectful context, and I think a more fitting context to the value, they're valuable just because they're people, but to their contributions as well.
Absolutely. And, I think I believed a myth for a really long time in my own work that, understanding that using identity as a lens through which to look at national security, and this is probably very similar in the science context, which is to say that that's not a helpful substantive lens. It's important because we care about these stories, we care about women, we care about historically marginalized groups, people of color, the queer community. So we should tell those stories just kind of on the merits because those stories matter, but they don't improve our understanding of national security. That was always the myth that I believed myself because it was the myth
that's
that I was
problematic.
told.
Right.
But what I have found through this work, and I am now a vocal proponent, is the simple fact, which is that I understand this war better than I ever would have because I looked at it through the lens of women, right? I wouldn't understand the support and supply infrastructure had I not switched my, lens slightly and put color into this black and white photo by looking at it through the viewpoint of women, because it totally broke open substantively something new about national security for me and about this war in particular. Which I think I always had a hunch about, but I never really understood how I could conceptualize it in a way that was interesting. And I think that's also true, with the science field as well. Like we sort of think, oh, well, what is identity going to tell us about, I don't know, cells? And then you find actually a lot, it turns out
exactly.
And so that I think is really exciting. And I hope that on your other podcasts, there are many women of World War II who were some of the best trained scientists in the United States and were recruited for that reason. Mary Sears comes to mind, others who were sort of pioneers in their field, and nobody knows about them, of course. So they did it in both ways, both for national security and for science. And I love those. And there are a couple of them in the book. So I hope people go sniffing around for them.
There's that crossover. No,
yeah,
100%. Yeah, I love it. So, I mean, I guess we've got our days that we have to move on to, but I could literally talk to you for hours because there's so many rich stories in this book that we haven't even gotten to. Lena, thank you so much for putting all of the effort into telling these stories. It's such an important conversation to be had, but B, for taking some time out of your schedule to share them with us today on the show.
Oh, it's been an absolute delight. This is fantastic. And thank you so much to you and to all your listeners for giving the valiant women the credit they deserve. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Everybody, the book is Valiant Women, the Extraordinary American Servicewomen Who Helped Win World War II by Dr. Lena Andrews. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.